good evening. If you enjoy drifting through these long, quiet histories, please remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. It is always a pleasure to know the many corners of the world that join us here. Tonight, we step into the shadowed lanes of an old English village, where the air is heavy with whispers. The year was in its late autumn, in the waning years of the 15th century, when the light lay low and weak upon the land, and the wind carried the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. This was a season of long nights and misty mornings, when the air seemed to hang thick with the memory of summer yet could no longer keep its warmth. The village of Ashcombe lay nestled between slow, rolling hills, their crests crowned with the last tattered remnants of oak and beech leaves. Its lanes were little more than hardened mud paths, marked by the ruts of cartwheels and the prints of hooves. The cottages stood low and crooked, half-timbered with wattle and daub, their thatched roofs uneven and moss-darkened from years of rain. The chimneys gave thin threads of smoke that rose into the grayness, merging with the breath of the earth itself. Within, each home smelled of earth floors, soot, and the faint sour tang of stored apples or drying herbs. The parish church stood apart upon a rise, its tower square and weathered, its bells dulled by age but still resonant on the hour. The churchyard stones leaned slightly, as though the earth had shifted beneath them over centuries. Around the edges of the village stretched hedgerows tangled with hawthorn and bramble, already stripped of most berries, their blackened leaves curling with the frost. The fields lay stubbled and empty now after harvest, with only a few stubborn scarecrows bending in the wind. Among the villagers, certain figures were more often remarked upon than others. There was John Weaver, the reeve, whose hands were thick and scarred from work, and whose eyes carried the pale gray of weathered stone. His voice was slow, deliberate, and not often raised, yet when it was, the others listened. Mistress Ellen, the midwife, was small-boned and quick-eyed, her back bent but her step still certain. She smelled faintly of rosemary and smoke, and her hands were always warm, even on cold mornings. Then there was Alice Redding, who lived alone in a small, leaning cottage at the far edge of the village, near the brook where the willows trailed their branches in the dark water. She was neither old nor young, but her face was weathered in the manner of one much in the open air. She often walked abroad at odd hours, gathering plants that others could not name. Her black hair, streaked with early threads of silver, was often tied loosely beneath a faded kerchief. The children sometimes followed her at a distance, daring one another to call her name and run. In the manor house on the hill above the village lived Sir Edmund Halewell, a man of middle years with a broad frame and a measured tread. His household was the largest employer in Ashcombe, his authority second only to the priests in the eyes of most. Father Thomas, the priest, was gaunt, his face long and sallow, his sermons lingering often on the dangers of sin and the snares set by the devil in everyday life. These were years when the old fears still walked the land alongside the new laws. In the market towns, stories traveled on the lips of traders, of women taken in the night for consorting with spirits, of confessions wrung by ordeal, of fires lit in distant fields. The great cities spoke of such matters in proclamations and pamphlets, but here in Ashcombe, news arrived softened, shaped into whispers over ale or beside the hearth. Yet even softened, these whispers took root. It was said that in some parishes, witches were known by the mark upon their skin, a blemish that did not feel pain when pricked. Others swore that the witch's home would never keep a cat without the creature behaving strangely. A few claimed that the milk in a witch's home would sour too quickly, or that her bread would rise without yeast. The people of Ashcombe carried these fragments like small stones in their pockets, never certain when they might be needed. Autumn was the season for such talk. Long nights bred long suspicions. Shadows were deep in the lanes now, and the sound of an unseen step on the frosted grass could set the mind to turning. In the third week of November, a sharp wind came from the east, carrying with it a brittle chill that set every door creaking on its hinges. The days began with a weak, colorless dawn and ended before the last tasks of the field were done. It was in such dimness that small events began to gather meaning. One evening, a child fell ill, his skin hot and eyes wandering in fever. His mother swore she had seen a shadow at the foot of his bed the night before, and though others told her it must have been no more than a fold of the blanket, her voice carried something uneasy in it. 2 hens from the Reeves flock were found dead in their roost, their bodies untouched but their necks strangely twisted, and more than one villager spoke of hearing soft knocking on their shutters at night, though the lanes outside lay empty. In the alehouse, such things were discussed slowly, with long silences between remarks. Some nodded, saying only that the year had been a hard one and such troubles were to be expected. Others leaned closer, speaking in lowered voices of curses and charms, of eyes that lingered too long, of words muttered over water drawn from the brook. The name of no one person was spoken yet, but the air in Ashcombe seemed denser, as though the mists had settled inside the walls as well as without. By the month's turn, the last leaves had fallen and frost clung like glass to the hedges. The brook's surface was filmed with ice at dawn, and even the church bell seemed to ring more faintly in the cold air. The village's work slowed. More hours were spent indoors, more time given to telling old stories to pass the dark. The stories now seemed to circle one another, drawing in, their details sharper with each telling. In the stillness of a late evening, the lane past Alice Redding's cottage lay empty, yet a lone candle burned in her window. From the far side of the brook, its light seemed to flicker oddly, as though someone passed and repassed before it within. Somewhere in the night, a dog barked, and then all was quiet again. The village slept uneasily, each mind turning on small remembered things. A glance, a word, a sound, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle that was not yet complete. And in that quiet, without any proclamation or accusation, the first seed of suspicion had been planted, its roots already seeking the dark places in which to grow. The wind moved through the bare branches with a long, low sigh, and the smoke from the chimneys thinned into the dark above. Ashcombe lay still, wrapped in frost and silence, the whispers of its people folded into the night like breath into cold air. The snow that came in the first week of December was thin and listless, falling from a colorless sky in slow, uneven patterns, dissolving upon the earth before nightfall. Ashcombe lay muted beneath it, the roofs damp and darkened, the lanes slick with thawing mud that clung to boots and cartwheels alike. Winter had not yet taken the village in its full grasp, but there was a sense, as one might feel from the tightening of a rope, that it was drawing steadily closer. The brook at the edge of the village ran narrow now, its water lapping sluggishly against rims of frost, the willows bowing over it as though burdened by the season. In such weather, life in Ashcombe took on a slower rhythm. The fields, long emptied of their grain, lay bare and ridged beneath pale light, the furrows crusted with ice. The hedgerows stood stripped, their tangled branches brittle and gray, save for a few withered leaves that clung stubbornly, rattling faintly in the wind. Beyond the hedgerows stretched the common pasture, where sheep huddled in tight clusters for warmth, their breath rising in faint white clouds. Within the village itself, the air hung with the sense of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint sourness of stored vegetables in cellars beneath the cottages. These scents had been the companions of every winter, yet this year they seemed sharper, as though the cold itself had drawn them nearer to the senses. Indoors, the rushlights burned longer hours, their dim flames bending with every draft that found its way through the walls. The sound of work, the thud of an axe splitting wood, the scrape of a broom over a floor, the hammering of a farrier's tools, reached the ear in clearer strokes now that the wind carried so little else. It was in this quieter season that certain matters, once left unspoken, began to return to the lips of the people. At first it was only in the alehouse, where men gathered near the fire after their work was done, tankards of ale in hand. The talk would wander idly, the quality of the last harvest, the state of the road to the market town, before circling, almost as if by accident, toward the strange events of recent weeks. A few remarked again upon the child who had fallen ill in late November, his fever refusing to break despite every remedy Mistress Ellen had offered. His mother had begun to speak, not loudly, of a figure she thought she had seen at the foot of the bed on the night before the sickness took hold. It had been no more than a shadow, she said, but one that had shape, and a stillness that did not seem natural. The others, though they offered words of reassurance, remembered her story. Then there were the hens, 2 from the Reeves' own flock, found dead in their roost without mark or wound, their necks bent in a manner that caused him to frown and fall silent. No fox, he said, would do such a thing, and no ordinary thief would take nothing but leave the bodies. There were also, it seemed, the knockings, not loud, not insistent, but soft and irregular, the sort of sound that might be made by a fingertip against the wood. Always on nights when the wind lay still, and always on the shutters of those who, upon opening their doors, found nothing but darkness. The old swore such things had been heard before in Ashcombe, in the winters of their youth, yet their eyes gave them away when they spoke of it. They remembered, perhaps, how such seasons had ended. From these scattered matters, threads began to form in the minds of the villagers, thin at first, then more tightly woven. It was said, in low voices, that in other parishes witches had been known by the company they kept. A certain bird that lingered near their house, a cat that would not take food from any other hand. Some were said to keep strange bundles of twigs, hidden in the thatch above their door, or small pouches buried at the threshold. And there was talk of the marks, patches of skin that would not bleed when pricked, often in places no honest woman would care to show. The people of Ashcombe did not speak of these things openly, but they carried them in their thoughts as one might carry a charm in a pocket, unseen yet always present. They began to notice, without willing it, the habits of those around them, who stepped out after dark, who fetched water from the brook at unusual hours, who, when crossing paths, would let their gaze rest a moment too long. Alice Redding, who lived alone in the leaning cottage by the brook, found herself observed more often now. She came to market as she always had, with bundles of dried herbs bound in twine, jars of thick, dark salve, and small vials of liquid the color of green glass. She accepted coin without much word, her eyes downcast, though some thought they caught the glimmer of a smile at the corner of her mouth when a bargain was struck. She still walked the lanes at dusk, her basket over one arm, her kerchief pulled low over her brow. Sometimes she paused beside the brook, her figure half veiled in the mist rising from the water, and bent to cut stems from plants no one else could name. Once, just after sunset, a laborer returning from the pasture swore he had seen her standing in the middle of the field, her arms lifted slightly as if feeling for something in the air. Her lips moved, though he heard no sound. He told no one at first, but by the week's end, the story was in the alehouse, retold with the addition that she had been facing the church as she stood there. Yet Alice was not the only one to draw such glances. Mistress Ellen, though respected for her skill in bringing children into the world, kept powders and dried roots in her apron pocket, and some began to wonder aloud whether all her remedies were truly godly in nature. Old Will Carter, too, was whispered about. He had the habit of muttering to himself while mending his nets, and though most assumed it was no more than idle talk, a few claimed the words were not of the English tongue. The priest, Father Thomas, seemed to sense the shifting air. His sermons, though never naming names, took on a harder edge, speaking of snares laid by unseen hands, of the devil's agents walking unmarked among honest folk. He reminded his congregation that vigilance was a holy duty, that to ignore signs was to invite danger into one's home. The people left the church with lowered eyes, each turning the words inward, measuring them against the faces they had seen that week. The days grew colder still. Frost clung to the thatch in the mornings, glistening faintly under a pale sun, and the brook bore a thin skin of ice that cracked beneath a thrown stone. The wind, when it came, rattled the bare branches and carried with it the faint metallic scent of snow yet to fall. Nights were long now, and the light from a lantern could be seen for half the length of a lane. In that darkness, shapes seemed to shift more easily. A branch moving against the moon, a figure disappearing behind a wall just before one turned the corner. One market day, as the villagers gathered near the churchyard wall, the talk turned again to the sick child. His mother, pale from sleepless nights, told of a dream she had had. A black bird had flown into the house and settled upon her son's chest, its weight pressing the breath from him. She woke to find the boy gasping, though no bird was in the room. She did not name the face she thought she saw in the bird's dark eyes, but those who heard her seemed to think of the same person. Still, no one spoke it aloud. The snow returned before the month's end, heavier this time, lying in drifts along the lanes and softening the shapes of roofs and walls. The world was quiet beneath it, the air muffled as though under a heavy cloth. Tracks in the snow became the subject of much talk, those of children playing, of dogs prowling, but also of smaller, lighter prints that led toward the fields and vanished there. In the morning they were gone beneath fresh snow, but the memory of them remained, woven into the growing fabric of unease. By now, the silence between neighbors carried as much meaning as their words. A glance held too long, a greeting left unanswered, a door closed a little too quickly. These were the threads from which suspicion was spun. The shape of an accusation was forming, though still it lay beneath the surface, waiting for the weight of one more event to bring it forth. Ashcombe, under its blanket of snow, seemed to be holding its breath. Winter had settled fully upon Ashcombe now. A silence draped over the village as if the earth itself held its breath. The first heavy snows had lain across the thatched roofs and cobbled lanes, softening their angles and dulling the sounds that once traveled freely in the air. The sky, a uniform gray that pressed low upon the hills, seemed always to threaten more frost, more snow, and longer nights. Each morning the villagers emerged to a world smothered in white, boots crunching on crusted snow, hands numbed by the icy wind that cut through wool and leather alike. The brook, now entirely hemmed in ice at its edges, carried only a thin trickle beneath its brittle surface. Willows leaned over the banks, their skeletal branches scraping the frozen water with an almost plaintive sound. The livestock huddled more tightly in the pens, their breaths rising in faint clouds, and the dogs moved cautiously across the crisped ground, sniffing at shadows that seemed darker beneath the snow. Even the crows lingered closer to the rooftops, their black feathers stark against the pale landscape, calling occasionally with harsh cries that sounded louder than they would have in warmer months. Inside the cottages, the warmth of the hearths did little to dispel the tension that had begun to gather like smoke in the corners of the village. Mistress Ellen's home was filled with the pungent scent of herbs drying over the fire, a mixture of rosemary, sage, and the sharp tang of wintergreen. She moved slowly, preparing teas and poultices for those who called in sickness or injury, her fingers precise yet unhurried. The villagers, increasingly aware of the oddities that had multiplied over recent weeks, approached her with a mixture of respect and unease, sometimes glancing toward the shadows behind her back as though expecting some unseen sign. Alice Redding, meanwhile, had retreated further into her solitude. Her walks by the brook became later and shorter, the thin candle in her window burning long into the night, casting flickering shadows across the walls and the snow outside. Those who passed by sometimes paused, unsure if they had imagined the quick movements she made in the darkness. Her hands, her head tilted, as though she listened to something no one else could hear. Children whispered of seeing her collect roots beneath the moonlight, muttering words that they could not repeat, and men in the alehouse shifted uneasily when the topic arose. The small town, in its winter quiet, had become a place of observation, of note-taking in the mind rather than on paper. Every odd occurrence, a milking that soured too quickly, a sudden chill in a warm room, a pot boiling over for no apparent cause, was catalogued silently by someone, often without comment. Even the reeve, John Weaver, who had long maintained the village order without fuss, found his thoughts straying to the oddities of the past weeks. He noted the child's illness, the dead hens, the knocks on doors, and the strange way Alice seemed to glide across the snow without leaving clear footprints. Each was small on its own, but together they formed a pattern, one that he could not shake. It was during the long afternoons by the fire, in the alehouse or by the hearth of one's own home, that these patterns were most spoken of, though still in careful, hushed tones. One day, as the sun dipped early behind the hills, Father Thomas visited the homes along the lane, offering counsel and prayer. He carried a small book of invocations, its pages worn and yellowed, and spoke softly of keeping hearts pure, of guarding against the devil's subtle work. In the shadowed corners of these rooms, the listeners began to share small tales of misfortune, of uncanny happenings, of objects moving or breaking without cause. Nothing was named outright, but the direction of thought was clear. It was not only the supernatural talk that heightened concern. It was the way people behaved. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in manner, hesitation before answering, fingers clenching the edge of a table. The children, though innocent, mirrored these tensions. They would glance toward Alice's cottage when she walked the lane, whispering to one another, following her from a distance before running back to the warmth of their parents. Even the dogs seemed unsettled, growling at shadows or refusing to cross certain paths. As days lengthened and the snow deepened, more signs were noted. A pot of milk left near the window curdled overnight, though no temperature change had occurred. A candle in Mistress Ellen's kitchen guttered strangely, as if blown by a wind that existed nowhere else. A neighbor reported hearing a voice calling their names softly from the hedge when the lane was empty. One by one, these observations were sewn into the tapestry of suspicion, each thread strengthening the sense that something unseen yet present moved among them. On a particularly bitter night, when the moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds and the wind shrieked along the rooftops, the villagers gathered at the alehouse, the largest and warmest place to seek companionship and news. Tankards of dark, foamy ale steamed in the cold air, and the fire at the center crackled and hissed. Conversation, as ever, began with the trivialities of daily life, the state of the roads, the condition of the livestock, the price of flour at the market. But slowly, inexorably, it turned to the extraordinary, the strange, the unexplained. An old man, his hands gnarled and voice quivering with age, spoke first. He told of a black cat that had appeared at his doorstep the previous week, sitting silently in the snow and staring into the house. He did not say the cat was Alice's or anyone's, but the name rose in the minds of those gathered, unspoken yet palpable. Another whispered of seeing a figure at the edge of the woods, bending over some root or herb, lips moving as if in secret incantation. The stories overlapped and multiplied, each listener adding detail as if to confirm the tale's veracity. By the hour's end, the atmosphere in the room was heavy with quiet accusation. No one yet named Alice directly, but glances exchanged across the tables conveyed the suspicions building in hearts long trained to read such signals. The Reeve, present but silent, felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. He knew the patterns of human fear, how quickly it could twist observation into judgment, and yet he understood that this web was already being spun. Father Thomas, who had come to the alehouse seeking warmth and counsel, found himself drawn into the conversation despite himself. He spoke cautiously of vigilance, of prayer, of the need to remain watchful for signs of spiritual corruption. His words, though general, were received as confirmation by those who had already noticed the smallest irregularities. The villagers' unease, once private, was now being shared, amplified by each new retelling. Outside, the snow fell more densely, covering tracks and softening the world. The wind made the eaves of the cottages groan, and the branches of the trees scraped against one another with hollow cries. Within the walls of homes and alehouse alike, hearts beat a little faster, eyes scanned the shadows a little longer, and ears strained for any sound that might break the winter's stillness. It was in such a world that the first voice would one day speak a name aloud, though the moment had not yet arrived. The tension was built upon ordinary events: a pot of stew gone sour, a sudden illness, a lantern extinguished. Yet each was magnified by the cold, the snow, the long nights that encouraged observation, rumor, and reflection. By midwinter, Ashcombe had become a village divided not by action, but by attention. Every unusual glance or gesture, every whisper or hesitation, had been noticed and filed away in the minds of neighbors. The first seed of accusation had grown unseen, nurtured by fear and the frost that lay heavy on the land. Even the churchyard, usually a place of quiet reflection, took on a different character. The stones leaned beneath snow, and the bare trees swayed in the icy wind. The bell tolled on the hour, each note resonant and somber, echoing across the village in a way that drew the thoughts inward. Fathers, mothers, and children paused in their work or play, listening and wondering at the hidden meaning behind every sound. Every shadow in the graveyard seemed to hint at the invisible threads weaving through the village, threads that bound suspicion and unease together in silence. By the end of Part 3, the air in Ashcombe was charged with a kind of quiet expectancy. The people felt it though they could not name it. Their glances lingered, their conversations softened, and each night the streets were emptied more swiftly, the lights in the cottages dimmed earlier. Something was coming, though none could yet say what form it would take. The seed of accusation, sown in whispers and shadowed observations, had grown enough to demand acknowledgement, but the spoken words had yet to solidify the fear into action. The village slept beneath the heavy snow, and the wind moved through the hedgerows with a low, persistent sigh. Smoke rose from chimneys and drifted in thin ribbons against the gray sky. Within each home, small fires glimmered, throwing shapes upon the walls, and hearts beat steadily, though a little faster than usual. Ashcombe was poised upon the edge of revelation, a single event away from lifting the veil of suspicion into open discourse. And in the quiet, the snow and frost carried the tension, silent witnesses to the thought that the unseen had already begun to shape the lives of the villagers in ways that no one could yet fully understand. The frost had thickened upon the lanes of Ashcombe, turning the earth to a brittle, glinting surface underfoot. The snow lay deeper now, the drifts rising against the cottages like small, pale hills, and the wind, sharp and insistent, swept through the bare hedgerows with a sibilant whisper. The village moved in slow, deliberate rhythms, each step on the frozen ground measured, each breath exhaled in clouds of white. Even the livestock seemed subdued, their huddled forms pressed close in pens, shivering beneath frost-laden roofs. Inside the cottages, the firelight cast long shadows across the walls, flickering upon the faces of those who huddled near the hearths. Mothers stirred thick soups and brewed herbal teas, their hands working slowly, their eyes often drifting to the window, as though expecting to see shapes or shadows moving across the snow. The sound of the wind through the eaves seemed to echo in the quiet rooms, carrying with it the unspoken anxieties that had gathered over the past weeks. Alice Redding's cottage remained the center of hushed attention. Though she had not ventured far in the deepest days of winter, her presence was felt everywhere. Villagers whispered of seeing her shadow pass beneath a window when no one else was about, of hearing the scrape of her basket against the floor in the darkness. Children spoke of odd shapes in the snow near the brook, shapes they could not quite name. Men in the alehouse exchanged furtive glances and murmured over tankards of ale, their voices lower than the wind outside. It was a slow accumulation of small, unsettling occurrences that brought the village to the point of action. A child who had been ill continued to fail, despite all remedies, and the mother's worry deepened into fear. Hens continued to die under strange circumstances, some with feathers singed as if by unseen fire. Objects in homes moved inexplicably. A chair shifted from its place, a pot overturned without cause, a loaf of bread found split as though cut by a sharp edge that no hand had wielded. Such events, in earlier seasons, might have been attributed to chance, to misfortune, to the weather. Now, under the weight of accumulated suspicion, they were taken as signs. The reeve, John Weaver, found himself drawn into a role he had not sought. The murmurs of the village, the uneasy glances, the hushed recountings of strange happenings, all pressed upon him. He had always been a man of calm reasoning, yet even he began to note patterns. The child's illness, the dead hens, the movement of shadows, the uncanny timing of sounds. Patterns that, when considered together, suggested intention, presence, perhaps malice. One evening, Father Thomas called a small gathering at the church. The congregation, sparse in the bitter cold, filled the wooden pews with faces drawn tight by worry. The priest spoke softly but with an edge of seriousness, that the devil's work could manifest in subtle ways, that vigilance was not merely recommended but necessary, and that the faithful should watch for signs of corruption in the village. His words, though general, were received with keen attention. The villagers were already primed to see meaning in the smallest occurrences. It was in the days following that the first accusation was spoken aloud. It began quietly, almost inadvertently, during the midday gathering at the alehouse. The topic was the child's illness once again, and the conversation, at first tentative, grew in volume as more added their own observations. The soot-blackened feather found in a hearth, the herbs that seemed to stir on their own in a cupboard, the unexplained sounds in the night. Then, with a measured voice, a woman spoke of Alice Redding. She did not shout. She did not demand. She simply recounted what she had seen. The shadows by the brook, the strange mutterings, the sudden appearances at the window. Her words were precise, careful, yet carried the weight of certainty. Heads turned, eyes widened, and in the silence that followed, the murmurs of others confirmed what had been felt in private. Suspicion had gained a name. Alice's name hung in the air like frost upon a branch, fragile yet undeniable. It was as if the word itself had crystallized the accumulated fears of the village. Those who had only noted strangeness now found themselves nodding in agreement. Those who had observed but said nothing now added their own accounts. The air was heavy with expectation, the warmth of the hearths failing to disperse the chill that had settled in the hearts of the listeners. The reeve, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, recognized the moment for what it was, the tipping of the scales from doubt to judgment. He did not speak, but he made note of each testimony, each glance, each hesitation. The role of discerning truth from fear, of guiding the village toward whatever course of action seemed necessary, now rested upon him. Over the following days, small inquiries began in whispered tones. Neighbors asked questions in passing, careful not to appear accusatory, yet gathering information. What herbs did Alice use? When did she go to the brook? Who had seen her after dusk? Each piece of knowledge was filed away, added to the mental ledger of suspicions. Mistress Ellen, ever skilled in her craft, was consulted less and watched more. Her remedies now considered potentially dangerous, her knowledge a double-edged sword. The physical world of Ashcombe seemed to echo the tension within its people. The snow, deep and unbroken, muffled footsteps, leaving tracks stark and clear for those who watched. Icicles formed along the eaves like jagged teeth, dripping slowly as the sun rose briefly, then refroze with the afternoon chill. Doors closed a moment too firmly, windows opened just slightly to hear the outside, and the slightest sound, a snapping branch, the flap of a shutter, was magnified into a portent. Alice herself remained outwardly calm, tending her hearth and her herbs with the same deliberate motions she had always used. Yet those who watched her saw changes. The tilt of her head, the narrowing of her eyes, the pauses between movements. Her isolation, once ordinary, now appeared deliberate, calculated. Her silence, once merely quiet, was now heavy with meaning. The first formal inspection was proposed by the reeve and sanctioned quietly by Father Thomas. A small group of villagers would visit Alice's cottage under the pretext of seeing to matters of safety and concern for the sick child. The group assembled with careful steps, voices subdued, eyes alert for any sign that might confirm or refute the growing suspicion. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they approached the leaning structure, its timbers dark against the pale drifts, smoke curling slowly from the chimney. Inside, the cottage was as expected, simple, orderly, and filled with the scents of herbs, wood smoke, and the faint tang of dried roots. The group noted the arrangement of shelves, the placement of jars, the bundles of twigs and plants hanging from the beams. Nothing appeared overtly sinister, yet every object, every shadow, seemed to speak to those predisposed to interpret meaning. Questions were asked quietly, observations made carefully, and each response from Alice, calm, precise, unflinching, was weighed against the mental scales of fear and expectation. By the end of the visit, the villagers departed with a mixture of relief and lingering doubt. No overt transgression had been observed, yet the unease persisted. Alice's presence, her practices, her very manner, had become inseparable from the whisperings of misfortune that had gathered over the winter. In the minds of many, the seed planted weeks before had now taken root. The act of suspicion had solidified into something more tangible, ready to grow into accusation and action. The snow continued to fall, relentless and quiet, covering tracks, softening the edges of the village, and muting the world. Yet beneath its white veil, tension wound tighter with each passing day. Glances were exchanged across market tables, doors closed a moment sooner, voices lowered in conversation. Ashcombe had entered a season not of simple winter, but of watchfulness, of readiness for the next incident, of the slow, deliberate unfolding of fear into judgment. By the close of Part 4, the village had moved beyond private suspicion into collective awareness. A name had been spoken aloud for the first time. Observations and rumors had coalesced into a tangible pattern. And in the frozen lanes and snowbound cottages, the people of Ashcombe now lived not only in the cold of winter, but in the cold weight of their shared apprehension. The stage was set for what would follow. The methods, the scrutiny, the subtle and careful acts by which they would attempt to discern the presence of the unseen, the unholy, the alleged witch among them. Alice Redding remained at the center of this watchfulness. Though she continued her routines with a calm precision, her presence was now inseparable from the scrutiny of the village. She tended her herbs, arranging them with care upon the shelves, grinding roots into powders, and simmering draughts of bittersweet scent. Each motion, each small sound, was noted by those who passed her door or peered from the corners of streets. The children who had once followed her playfully now approached only at a distance, their eyes wide and whispers hushed. It was in this climate that the Reeve John Weaver, guided by Father Thomas, organized the first formal procedures meant to test the truth of the suspicions. The gatherings were held with solemnity, each step taken deliberately to avoid rashness, yet the undercurrent of collective expectation was palpable. The methods employed were those recorded in parish traditions and whispered among the learned in neighboring towns. The observation of marks, the test of balance and weight, the scrutiny of herbs and potions. Each was applied not with haste, but with meticulous attention, the village's own sense of morality and propriety guiding their careful hands. The first examination took place within Alice's cottage, in the main room where the fire burned steadily. The light from the hearth illuminated the wooden beams and the bundles of herbs hanging overhead, casting shadows that danced in rhythm with the flames. The villagers assembled in small clusters, each maintaining a respectful distance yet leaning forward with intent. Father Thomas moved quietly among them, speaking softly of prayer and observation, urging calm and order. Alice herself remained composed, her hands folded before her, her gaze steady yet distant. She did not offer words beyond what was necessary, yet each gesture, each movement, was scrutinized. The observers noted the shape of her hands, the clarity of her eyes, the lines of her face in the firelight. They examined the bundles of herbs she had prepared, touching leaves and roots with measured care, breathing in the scents of sage, rosemary, and the faint bitterness of wormwood. None of the items presented any obvious cause for concern, yet the accumulation of minute details was enough to occupy the attention of the villagers. In the corners of the room, children whispered softly among themselves, eyes wide, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. They noted the small movements, the flutter of a sparrow at the window, the tap of a twig against the roof, the faint murmur of Alice speaking to herself as she prepared her herbs. These seemingly trivial occurrences were catalogued in the minds of adults and children alike, each building upon the narrative of suspicion that had grown steadily over the winter months. Outside, the snow continued to fall intermittently, adding a soft muffling to the world. The wind pressed against the window panes and the doors, bringing with it the faint, metallic tang of ice and frost. Footsteps outside were heard before they were seen, and the crunch of compacted snow became a signal to pause, to observe, to consider the meaning behind each movement. The very environment of Ashcombe seemed to conspire with the fears of its inhabitants, reinforcing the sense that something unseen yet potent was at work among them. The next stage of observation involved the study of bodily markings, a practice long whispered about but seldom employed. Alice was asked to display her arms and neck, her hands remaining still as the villagers examined the skin for blemishes, scars, or the so-called witch's mark. The room held its breath, the firelight flickering against the pale skin of her forearms. Though no mark was visible to the eyes of the villagers, the tension was not diminished. The act of observation itself was a form of testing, a ritual of attentiveness that reinforced the seriousness of the occasion. At the same time, Father Thomas led a quiet reflection upon signs of spiritual corruption. He instructed the villagers to note any unusual behavior, any unnatural knowledge of herbs or remedies, any deviation from accepted practice. The guidance was gentle but insistent, reminding the observers that vigilance was both duty and safeguard. The combination of ritual, observation, and prayer created a deliberate rhythm, a cadence to the days that heightened awareness without overt panic. Evenings were spent in quiet discussion, the villagers comparing notes in the dim light of the alehouse or around hearths in their own homes. They spoke cautiously, each phrase measured, each observation framed as a question rather than a declaration. In these discussions, the story of Alice's routines, her visits to the brook, her preparation of remedies, and her measured movements was pieced together into a composite image. Though nothing overtly threatening had occurred, the act of scrutiny itself lent gravity to the smallest anomalies. Among the village elders, talk turned to the subtler arts of discernment. They discussed the patterns of the seasons, the habits of animals, the signs that might indicate an unseen presence. The croaking of a raven on the churchyard wall, the restless movement of livestock, the shifting of shadows across walls, all became part of the tapestry of observation. Each villager, in turn, became both witness and participant, cataloging occurrences in their minds with the seriousness of record-keeping. The children, though often unwittingly, played their part as well. They reported sightings of shapes in the snow, of sounds in the woods, of glimpses of movement near the cottages. Their observations, while simple, were noted carefully by adults, their accounts woven into the growing narrative. Even the faintest tremor of fear or curiosity on a child's face was considered evidence of awareness, a reflection of the collective consciousness that had begun to dominate the village. Alice, for her part, continued her routines with an outward calm that masked the quiet vigilance she herself practiced. She tended her herbs, prepared her drafts, and moved through the snow-laden village with the same careful steps she had always taken. Yet she was acutely aware of the eyes upon her, of the whispers and glances, and of the delicate balance between routine and observation. Her awareness of being watched added attention to her actions, a measured precision that only heightened the interest of those who scrutinized her. As the days lengthened, further tests were applied, each conducted with solemnity and deliberate care. Small items were handled, examined, and replaced. Patterns in the snow were traced and considered. Sounds in the night were catalogued and discussed. These exercises were not violent, not intrusive beyond the boundary of reason. Yet they carried the weight of ritualized observation, a subtle insistence upon order and measurement. The villagers began to recognize the rhythm of their scrutiny, the cadence of daily attentiveness. Each morning brought the recounting of events from the previous night. Each evening, the collation of observations into coherent understanding. Through this methodical approach, suspicion was transformed from vague unease into structured inquiry, the abstract sense of danger made tangible by careful attention. By midwinter, Ashcombe had become a village of quiet watchfulness. The snow, once soft and light, lay heavy and thick, absorbing the sounds of footsteps and voices alike. The days were short, the sun low and pale, and the nights long, giving ample space for observation and reflection. In this climate, the methods of discernment, the watching, the testing, the ritualized examination, became a form of daily life, a measured engagement with the uncertainty that had settled over the village. The culmination of these procedures was not dramatic. It was the steady accumulation of knowledge, the slow verification of detail, the careful weighing of evidence. In every glance, every observation, every whisper, the villagers reinforced their understanding of Alice Redding, the central figure in this unfolding inquiry. And though no action yet had been taken beyond observation, the stage was fully prepared for the next phase, where judgment, deliberation, and consequence would inevitably follow. By the close of this fifth part, the village existed in a delicate balance between routine and suspicion, between ordinary life and the extraordinary vigilance that had become necessary. The snow continued to fall, the wind whispered through the hedgerows, and the hearths burned steadily in each home. Ashcombe had entered a season not only of winter, but of careful watching, a slow unfolding of the processes by which ordinary villagers might discern the presence of that which was unseen, unknown, and feared. The tension was woven into every action, every glance, every measured word, preparing the village for the eventual, inevitable turning of observation into accusation. Ashcombe lay beneath a pall of white, the snow now thick upon the ground and pressed hard by the passage of many feet. The wind swept along the hedgerows with a persistent murmur, slipping through the skeletal trees and rattling the fragile shutters on cottages. The air, sharp and cold, carried the faint tang of wood smoke and frost, mingling with the distant scent of frozen earth. Footfalls were crisp and solitary, echoing against the quiet lanes, marking the passage of those who moved with measured care. Within the village, the mood had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Observation had become ritual, and ritual had begun to take shape in formalized acts. The villagers, guided by Father Thomas and the Reeve John Weaver, approached the cottage of Alice Redding with deliberate steps. Each movement, each breath, seemed weighted by anticipation, though none spoke openly of the fear that lay beneath. The snow crunched beneath their boots, a rhythmic accompaniment to the quiet procession, and the occasional creak of frost-laden beams marked the passing hours with almost musical precision. Alice herself moved among her herbs, unaware at first of the assembly forming outside her door. She set roots and dried flowers carefully upon the shelves, grinding powders with a pestle that echoed faintly against the stone hearth. Her hands, deft and calm, betrayed no haste, yet each precise motion carried the awareness of being observed. The flickering light of the fire cast shadows upon the walls, elongating and bending them in ways that made the room seem both larger and more intimate, a private stage upon which her daily life unfolded. The villagers entered the cottage one by one, silent and cautious, their eyes shifting from Alice to the arrangements of herbs, to the hearth, to the small table where powders and roots were laid with care. Father Thomas led, his voice soft, offering measured words of prayer and guidance. The Reeve followed, noting the posture, expression, and gestures of every observer. The quietude of the room contrasted with the unspoken tension, a tautness that made the very air seem thicker, the warmth of the hearth insufficient to ease the chill that clung to their minds. The first formal examination began with the herbs themselves. Each plant, each root was inspected, turned over, smelled, and sometimes touched. Sage, rosemary, wormwood, and rue filled the room with their layered scents, and each inhalation carried a weight of scrutiny. Villagers murmured softly to one another about the potential uses of each plant, what might be ordinary medicine, what could be intended for more secret purposes. Alice remained calm, offering the occasional clarification. Though her words were simple and precise, never defensive, yet each description was weighed carefully by those present. Next came observation of Alice herself. Her hands were extended slowly, wrists turned, fingers spread, as the villagers examined them for blemishes, scars, or marks that might signify hidden pacts or unholy touches. Father Thomas instructed that attention be paid not merely to physical forms, but to manner, to habit, to the quiet rhythms of gesture and posture. Alice's stillness became a focus. Each subtle motion, each breath, each tilt of the head was considered with deliberation. The observers moved through the room with care, touching nothing without necessity, speaking only in low, measured tones. In the corners, the children watched, their breaths shallow, their wide eyes flicking from face to face. They noted the gentle pressure of a hand against a shelf, the flick of a wrist as Alice adjusted a bundle of herbs, the way she straightened a cloak before sitting. Each minor act was catalogued, absorbed into the fabric of the day, interpreted through the lens of caution and curiosity. The room was heavy with attention, yet calm, as if every person understood that haste or noise could disturb the fragile balance of observation. Outside, the wind pressed insistently against the windows, rattling the small panes and sending a whispering chill into the room. The snow continued to fall, settling over the ground in silent accumulation, masking footprints, softening the contours of the village. The sound of passage and movement became more noticeable, amplified by the hush of expectation within the cottage. Even the animals, huddled near the hearth or tied outside in the frost, seemed to sense the tension, moving cautiously or remaining still in watchful quiet. The next set of examinations involved the alignment of daily routines with the natural order. Villagers asked questions quietly about times of activity, patterns of work, and the use of herbs and remedies. Alice answered with careful clarity, detailing her preparation of poultices, her visits to the brook for water and roots, the timing of her daily chores. Each response was noted meticulously, assessed for consistency, and weighed against prior observations. The exercise, though simple, carried the weight of ritual. Every detail mattered. Every small deviation could imply intention or design beyond ordinary understanding. As the day wore on, the procedures grew more methodical. Small items were placed upon tables for examination, powders sifted, roots measured, liquids poured and observed. The observers spoke little, their focus total, their minds cataloging every detail. Father Thomas moved quietly among them, offering guidance on conduct, instructing them to remain calm and impartial, and reminding all that the work was one of careful discernment, not hasty judgment. The rhythm of the procedures became almost meditative, a slow unfolding of attention and care that occupied the villagers fully. Alice's demeanor remained composed throughout. She moved deliberately, her hands steady, her eyes focused yet distant. She spoke when necessary, but rarely. Her words were precise, her gestures deliberate. The very calmness of her presence became a focal point, a point around which all observation revolved. Each motion, each breath, each adjustment of materials or posture was carefully considered by the assembled villagers, forming a tapestry of attention that combined curiosity, caution, and lingering unease. By the evening, the procedures had covered nearly every aspect of Alice's daily life that could be observed without intrusion. The hearth had been noted, the arrangement of herbs recorded, the actions of hands and posture scrutinized, and the flow of routine examined for consistency. The villagers departed slowly, stepping into the cold twilight with the snow underfoot muffling their passage. Even as they left, glances were cast back toward the cottage, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked, that each detail had been registered and considered. Night fell with a heavy quiet over Ashcombe. The snow deepened, covering the traces of the day, while the wind pressed through the village with a soft, persistent sigh. Lights glimmered in the cottages, casting long, dancing shadows upon the snow. Inside, families spoke quietly of what had been observed, their voices low, careful, measured. Each account, each interpretation, was added to the mental ledger, the cumulative understanding of Alice's habits, presence, and possible intentions. Even as sleep approached, the tension lingered. The village had entered a rhythm of observation and reflection, a deliberate and steady process that occupied both waking and dreaming minds. The shadow of suspicion had not yet culminated in action, yet it had become a continuous presence, entwined with the ordinary movements of daily life. The snow, the wind, the quiet lanes, and the flickering hearths all carried this weight, subtle and pervasive. By the close of this part, Ashcombe had settled into a new pattern. Observation and ritual, attention and reflection, had become the dominant currents of daily life. The villagers were engaged in measured acts of discernment, each movement, each word, each breath considered carefully, patiently, as they sought to understand what might dwell among them unseen. Alice's presence, calm and deliberate, continued to occupy the center of this scrutiny, her routines a focus of both fear and fascination. The stage was set, the procedures underway, and the quiet suspense of winter held the village in a tense, deliberate stillness. Every snow-laden lane, every darkened corner, every whisper carried with it the weight of anticipation. Ashcombe awaited the next step in its careful inquiry, poised between routine and revelation, between observation and the eventual turning of suspicion into judgment. The snow of Ashcombe had become both a blanket and a mirror, reflecting the pale winter light and softening the contours of the village, while simultaneously accentuating the sharpness of each shadow. The air was thin and cold, carrying the faint scent of frozen earth and wood smoke, mingling with the subtle fragrances of herbs and dried plants that persisted from Alice Redding's cottage. The wind moved with a whispering insistence through the skeletal branches of trees, tugging at shutters and rattling loose tiles with a faint, almost conversational murmur. Inside the cottages, life continued with a quiet intensity. Families gathered near the hearths, speaking softly of the day's observations, recounting the movement of villagers, the position of objects, and the shifting patterns of frost and snow. Each small event was noted with care, as though every detail held significance beyond its apparent ordinariness. The villagers' eyes flicked to the doors and windows more often now, their attention sharpened by weeks of observation and careful scrutiny. Alice moved through her cottage with habitual grace, tending her herbs and preparing her mixtures with meticulous care. Her hands, steady and deliberate, ground roots and leaves into powders, measured liquids, and arranged dried bundles upon shelves that lined the walls. Though outwardly composed, a quiet awareness thrummed beneath her calm exterior. She knew that every action, every gesture, every subtle movement was being observed, catalogued, and weighed. The Reeve, John Weaver, continued his methodical oversight. He spoke with Father Thomas in hushed tones about patterns observed in the village, the responses of neighbors, and the conduct of Alice herself. Their discussions were deliberate, structured, and focused on understanding rather than immediate judgment. The process, though slow, was designed to preserve order, to ensure that any action taken would be measured and, in their view, justifiable. The villagers, meanwhile, began to organize themselves around small tasks of observation. Some walked the lanes, noting the behavior of animals, the tracks in the snow, and the movement of those passing the cottages. Others lingered near windows or along hedgerows, recording sounds, the positions of smoke from chimneys, and the glances exchanged between neighbors. Every detail, no matter how minor, was incorporated into the growing ledger of attention that held the village in its quiet thrall. On one afternoon, a meeting was called within the church, where Father Thomas outlined further steps in the observation and assessment of Alice's activities. The assembly was deliberate, the words carefully chosen, the voice measured to calm as well as instruct. He spoke of the importance of mindfulness, of the need to distinguish ordinary occurrences from patterns that might signify intervention beyond the natural world. He reminded the villagers that their task was vigilance, not rash action, and that careful observation and prayer were the proper means to discern truth. The first part of this next stage involved what the villagers referred to as the study of ritual alignment. They were to note the timing and sequence of Alice's daily practices, the preparation of remedies, the visits to the brook, the arrangement of her herbs, and even the subtle gestures of her hands and eyes. Nothing was to be altered or disturbed. The exercise relied upon patient watching, on repeated, measured observation to detect inconsistencies or signs of deliberate concealment. Alice's routines were observed in almost silent accompaniment. A neighbor might step into the cottage briefly, glance at her hands as she crushed herbs, note the placement of a bundle, then withdraw quietly. Another might linger near the window, observing her approach and departure from the brook. Even the smallest gestures, turning a leaf, adjusting a pot, shifting her weight from one foot to another, were catalogued for comparison with prior observations. The careful attention itself seemed to heighten the significance of the ordinary. Evenings were spent in quiet collation. Notes were compared, observations recounted, and minor anomalies discussed with the solemnity of ritual. The villagers spoke in low tones, mindful that their words might themselves carry influence over others. The children were asked gently for their accounts, their recollections treated with equal seriousness, as their untrained eyes often detected subtleties that adults might overlook. Patterns began to emerge slowly, delicate yet persistent, as the accumulation of attentive observation transformed perception into something more tangible. The snow continued to fall intermittently, muffling footsteps and softening the contours of the village. Icicles hung like fragile chandeliers from eaves, dripping in the brief warmth of the midday sun before freezing again. The wind's constant sigh pressed through the hedgerows, carrying distant sounds, the shift of animal movement, and the quieted murmur of the village itself. Every sound and shadow was magnified by the collective attention, creating an almost sacred tension that wrapped the village in its embrace. Alice, ever aware of the scrutiny, moved through her day with measured precision. Her work at the hearth, the careful grinding of roots, the selection of dried leaves and flowers, became a form of performance, subtle, deliberate, and unspoken. Each motion was clean and exact, as though rehearsed, yet she maintained a calm authenticity that both reassured and unsettled the observers. In her stillness, there was power. In her routine, a quiet defiance against the ever-watchful eyes. At the edge of the village, men and women walked along the frozen lanes, noting the patterns of snow and ice. Footprints were traced, lines of travel mapped, and any unusual disturbance recorded. The behavior of animals was observed with similar care. Birds perched silently in the skeletal branches, livestock moved cautiously within their pens, and even the rustle of a small mammal through the underbrush was noted as potentially significant. The village became a network of watchfulness, a community bound by attentiveness and the shared gravity of suspicion. The first moments of more formal testing were also introduced, though still restrained. Alice was asked to handle small items, move herbs from one container to another, and demonstrate the preparation of simple remedies. These acts, while ordinary, were scrutinized with an intensity that turned routine into ritual. Every gesture, every motion of the hands, every shift of gaze, was considered for meaning, and subtle variations from prior observation were catalogued with care. Father Thomas guided these examinations, ensuring that decorum and gentleness were maintained. He emphasized that the process was not punitive, but instructive. The purpose was to discern truth, to understand the patterns that might indicate unseen influence. His voice, calm and measured, carried the authority of both spiritual guidance and procedural oversight, reinforcing the structure of the observations while tempering the natural anxieties of the villagers. Even as the formal processes continued, informal observations persisted. Neighbors noted what Alice did when she thought herself unobserved. The slight tilt of her head, the pause in her work, the turning of a page in a book. Each detail was recorded in memory, compared with prior days, and added to the subtle fabric of evidence being woven in silence. The children's eyes, attentive and curious, often caught movements unnoticed by adults, contributing their own innocent, yet valuable, observations. The nights in Ashcombe were long and filled with quiet reflection. The villagers gathered around hearths, recounting the day's events, considering inconsistencies, and pondering the subtle cues that might have meaning. Sleep came with a mixture of relief and anticipation, carrying with it dreams colored by observation, suspicion, and the cold, crystalline light of the snow outside. Even in sleep, the awareness of scrutiny persisted, the mind cataloging, connecting, and weighing each subtle sign. By the end of Part 7, the village had fully entered a cycle of observation, reflection, and cautious action. The tension had grown, not through sudden events, but through the steady accumulation of careful attention. Alice remained at the center, her routines and gestures under constant scrutiny, yet her calm, deliberate presence turned each observation into an act of patience and quiet intrigue. Ashcombe, though quiet under the blanket of snow, was alive with watchfulness. The villagers moved with measured intent, their senses attuned to the faintest variations in sound, movement, and pattern. The village had become a web of attentiveness, each resident both observer and participant, each gesture carrying weight and meaning. The stage was fully set for the next phase, where observation would inevitably converge with action, and the careful, deliberate processes of discernment might begin to take more decisive forms. The days of Ashcombe had grown shorter, the sun lingering only briefly above the horizon before sinking behind the skeletal line of distant hills. Snow pressed heavily against the earth, forming a continuous white expanse that softened the village's outlines and muffled every sound. The wind, pale and insistent, slipped through the bare hedgerows and along the narrow streets, carrying with it the faintest echoes of movement, the hushed steps of villagers, and the occasional groan of timber settling under frost. Alice Redding continued her routines, the rhythm of her day unbroken outwardly, yet each motion was weighed against the awareness of eyes upon her. She ground roots with precision, arranged dried herbs, and stirred potions over the low-burning hearth. Each gesture, however small, was catalogued by those who watched. The tilt of her head, the motion of her fingers, the subtle shift of weight from one foot to another, all were recorded and compared with previous days' observations. The Reeve, John Weaver, and Father Thomas coordinated the next stage of inquiry. Their purpose was not immediate accusation but methodical testing, to discern whether the patterns of Alice's movements and the use of her herbs suggested ordinary craft or something beyond understanding. The steps were deliberate, ritualized, and designed to maintain calm while subtly intensifying scrutiny. The first formal test involved the use of water and balance, a practice long whispered about in Ashcombe. Alice was guided to the small brook that ran along the village edge, where the water moved sluggishly beneath a thin layer of ice. She carried simple objects, stones, small twigs, and a few containers of liquid, performing the motions requested of her with quiet attentiveness. Villagers observed from a respectful distance, noting how she handled the items, the steadiness of her hands, and the clarity of her gaze. Even the slight ripple of water against her fingers, or the angle of a tossed twig, was recorded mentally by each witness. The children, ever present at the edges of these proceedings, observed with wide eyes. They noticed the flutter of a sparrow above the brook, the movement of fish beneath the ice, and the occasional rustle of hidden animals in the brush. Their small, innocent attentiveness contributed subtle details to the broader observations, reinforcing the collective impression of watchfulness without requiring spoken testimony. Back in the village, other tests were conducted within the cottage. Alice was asked to handle herbs in specific sequences, prepare small remedies under instruction, and arrange objects according to prescribed patterns. The observers were quiet, moving slowly from one detail to another, checking consistency and precision. Each step was recorded, compared, and assessed, as patterns of routine were weighed against the possibility of deviation or hidden intent. The air was heavy with the smell of herbs, wood smoke, and frost pressed against the door and window panes. Shadows from the low sun fell across the walls in long, shifting lines, creating a subtle interplay of light and dark that seemed to mirror the tension within the room. Even the fire, steady in the hearth, cast flickering forms that reminded the villagers of the delicate balance between warmth and cold, presence and absence, observation and hidden truth. Father Thomas offered occasional guidance, reminding observers to remain impartial, to distinguish between ordinary practice and extraordinary action, and to allow for calm reflection before reaching any conclusion. His voice, measured and soft, carried authority but never harshness, reinforcing the solemnity of the process and the need for patient attentiveness. As days passed, the testing continued with subtle variations. Items were moved, roots crushed, liquids poured and observed. Each repetition reinforced patterns or highlighted minor deviations that drew further scrutiny. Alice's calm composure remained unchanged, her hands steady, her voice even, her movements deliberate. Yet the weight of observation added attention to every gesture, a quiet insistence that even ordinary actions could carry consequence. In the evenings, villagers gathered to compare observations. Notes were recounted, minor inconsistencies debated, and subtle patterns discussed with care. The children's reports were woven into these reflections, their impressions valued for their clarity and simplicity. The snow outside softened the outlines of buildings and pathways, but it also carried sound and attention, magnifying every step, every whisper, every quiet motion. The Reeve and Father Thomas introduced another aspect of testing, based upon timing and sequence. Alice was observed for the consistency of her daily routines. When she visited the brook, when she tended the hearth, how she arranged her herbs, and even the rhythm of her breathing and movements. Every deviation, however small, was catalogued and weighed against prior knowledge. The exercise was patient and methodical, designed to produce insight rather than fear. Alice herself seemed to embrace the quiet rhythm imposed by observation. She moved deliberately, preparing her remedies, tending her herbs, and attending to her small domestic tasks. Each day was a study in controlled motion, her presence calm and steady despite the heightened awareness surrounding her. The observers noted not only the precision of her actions but the serenity in her expression, the patience in her hands, and the subtle confidence that lay in her measured gaze. Even at night, the village remained attentive. Lights glimmered in windows, shadows flickered upon snowdrifts, and the wind whispered through the narrow lanes. Footsteps and the movement of animals were noted, while faint noises within the cottages drew quiet attention. The village was both alive and still, each resident participating in a careful choreography of observation and reflection. The cumulative effect of these observations was a slow, almost imperceptible tension that threaded through every household. While no overt accusation had yet been made, the persistent scrutiny transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, the familiar into the mysterious. Every routine, every gesture, every shadow became part of the tapestry of attention that defined Ashcombe during this season. By the close of Part 8, the village had entered a rhythm that was both methodical and tense. Observation had become a full-time engagement, reflection an ever-present companion. Alice's calm presence was at the center, her routines providing the measure against which the villagers gauged possibility, intent, and meaning. The stage was set for deeper tests, where patterns might be interpreted, deviations might be weighed, and the next steps in the process of discernment would inevitably emerge. The snow continued to blanket the village, muffling footsteps, softening edges, and reflecting the pale winter light. The wind, persistent and insistent, moved through the lanes, carrying with it the quiet murmur of anticipation. Within the cottages, beside the hearths, and along the frozen lanes, the villagers remained watchful, their attention sharpened, their senses attuned, their minds prepared for what the following days might reveal. Ashcombe held its breath in a season of careful waiting, poised between observation and the quiet turning of suspicion into examination. The village of Ashcombe lay in quiet under the pale winter sun, its snowbound lanes and frost-laden rooftops reflecting the subtle light with a muted brilliance. The wind moved with a gentle insistence through the skeletal hedgerows, whispering among bare branches and pressing faintly against shuttered windows. Each sound, each movement, was amplified in the hush that seemed to settle upon the village, as though the very air had become attuned to observation and careful attention. Alice Redding's routines continued with a measured precision, the steady rhythm of her day unbroken. She ground herbs into fine powders, stirred liquids over the hearth, and arranged bundles of dried roots and flowers with deliberate care. Yet beneath this calm exterior, an awareness thrummed quietly. She knew every action, every gesture, every pause was being observed, weighed, and interpreted. The presence of eyes upon her, whether overt or hidden, added subtle tension to even the smallest movements. The Reeve, John Weaver, and Father Thomas continued their methodical oversight. They guided the villagers through more formalized observation, introducing slight variations in the tests and exercises to gauge consistency and attentiveness. Items were moved, roots and leaves rearranged, liquids poured and observed for their behavior, while Alice performed each act with patient exactness. Every repetition reinforced prior knowledge or revealed minute differences, each analyzed carefully by those present. Outside, children lingered at the edges of cottages, their eyes wide, catching subtle details unnoticed by adults. They noted the small flicker of shadow, the glint of sunlight on ice, the movement of animals across snow-drifted paths. Their observations, while often simple and innocent, were woven into the village's collective attentiveness, adding a layer of subtle awareness that adults could not easily replicate. The villagers themselves moved with deliberate care, walking the snowbound streets, noting footsteps, animal tracks, and the shifting patterns of frost and ice. They observed the placement of smoke from chimneys, the position of doors and shutters, the gestures of those passing along the lanes. Each detail was compared with prior observations, forming a slow accumulation of knowledge that transformed ordinary days into exercises of discernment and subtle scrutiny. Alice's cottage became a focal point of attention. The herbs, roots, and powders she handled were observed closely. The arrangement of objects upon shelves and tables was noted for consistency. Her movements through the space were catalogued for rhythm and intention. Even the smallest gesture, a tilt of the head, a shift of weight, the angle of a finger, was measured against prior observations, interpreted as either ordinary or potentially significant. Father Thomas spoke softly to the villagers, reminding them to maintain calm, impartiality, and careful reflection. He urged attention to detail without judgment, guidance without harshness, and vigilance without panic. His presence reinforced the structure of observation, lending a quiet authority to the slow accumulation of insights that would ultimately shape the village's understanding of Alice and her practices. As the days passed, the procedures grew slightly more complex. Alice was asked to perform sequences of actions with herbs and liquids to demonstrate the preparation of remedies under the watchful eyes of the assembled villagers. Every motion was noted, the pressure of her hands, the sequence of her steps, the way she handled each object. Subtle deviations, if they occurred, were catalogued and compared with previous sessions, adding depth and nuance to the ongoing scrutiny. Evenings were spent in careful discussion, as villagers gathered near hearths to recount observations, consider inconsistencies, and discuss minor deviations from expected patterns. The children's recollections were incorporated, valued for their simplicity and clarity. Each conversation, however quiet, reinforced the web of attentiveness that now defined Ashcombe, and the village's shared focus on Alice remained steadfast and unbroken. The snow outside softened contours, muffled footsteps, and reflected the dim winter light, yet it also heightened awareness. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shift of smoke from a chimney, Every movement of a shadow across a wall became significant under the lens of collective observation. The village existed in a delicate balance between ordinary life and heightened scrutiny, each resident both observer and participant in the unfolding assessment. Alice's calm composure remained unshaken. She moved with deliberate precision, attending to her herbs, her mixtures, and the small domestic tasks of daily life. Each day became a study in patient endurance, her gestures measured, her speech limited to necessity, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the persistent observation that surrounded her. Even the firelight seemed to reflect her stillness, shadows stretching and contracting in rhythm with her motions, mirroring the subtle tension of the room. The Reeve and Father Thomas introduced new measures of assessment. Slight variations in routine were requested, minor tasks rearranged, subtle tests of memory and attention introduced. Alice responded with the same calm precision, yet every adjustment, every deliberate variation, was catalogued by observers, analyzed for intent, and considered for its significance. The process remained slow, deliberate, and highly ritualized, each action reinforcing the sense of purpose and structure within the village. The villagers' attentiveness extended even into their dreams. Each night, as snow drifted across the lanes and winds whispered through the skeletal trees, thoughts of Alice and her routines occupied both waking and sleeping minds. Subtle patterns, observed in daylight, were revisited in memory. Minor gestures were replayed, potential meanings considered and weighed. The village existed in a state of continuous reflection, the slow accumulation of knowledge shaping both perception and expectation. By midwinter, the tests and observations had continued for weeks, each day layering insight upon insight. Alice's routines were consistent, her gestures deliberate, her words careful and precise. Yet the persistent scrutiny of the villagers, guided by Father Thomas and the Reeve, had begun to turn ordinary actions into subtle enigmas. Every repetition, every motion, every sequence was imbued with potential significance, each interpreted as either benign or suggestive, depending upon the observer's perspective. The village itself had adapted to the slow rhythm of scrutiny. Days were measured not only by sunlight and the passage of hours, but by the sequences of observation, the timing of routines, and the careful noting of detail. Snowfall became a marker of time. Footsteps, gestures, and sounds a form of quiet communication. Even the smallest anomaly, a misaligned bundle, a differently placed herb, a pause longer than usual, was significant within the slow rhythm of attention that now dominated Ashcombe. Alice's awareness of this scrutiny remained keen. She continued her work with deliberate precision, her calm presence serving both as reassurance and challenge to the observers. Every gesture was intentional, every word carefully measured, and each motion through her cottage or along the snowbound lanes became part of the ongoing dialogue of observation. In her stillness, there was a quiet defiance. In her routine, a subtle insistence upon autonomy and continuity. As the ninth part draws to a close, the tension within Ashcombe had become nearly tangible. The villagers, absorbed in meticulous observation and careful reflection, existed in a state of quiet vigilance. Alice, at the center of this attention, remained composed and deliberate, her presence a steadying yet provocative force. The accumulation of days, sequences, and patterns had created a subtle suspense, a slow but persistent build toward eventual revelation, though no explicit accusation had yet been made. The snow continued to blanket the village, muffling sounds, softening edges, and reflecting pale light. Wind whispered through lanes and over rooftops, carrying hints of movement and shadow. Within cottages and along frozen paths, the villagers remained watchful, their attention keen, their awareness attuned to the slightest detail. Ashcombe existed in a delicate balance, between routine and scrutiny, observation and interpretation, calm and the quiet anticipation of what the unfolding weeks might reveal. The light of Ashcombe was pale and thin, filtering weakly through clouds heavy with frost. The snow lay thick upon the ground, softening the shapes of cottages and hedgerows, muting the sounds of footsteps and the low murmur of the wind. The village moved in deliberate rhythm, each gesture measured, each word considered, as though the very air demanded restraint and attention. Alice Redding's day began as always, with precise attention to the small rituals that governed her household. She arranged herbs with care, grinding roots to powder and placing each bundle with deliberate exactness. Water from the brook was measured and poured with steady hands. Smoke from the hearth drifted lazily, carrying scents of sage and rosemary that mingled with the chill of the room. Every action, while seemingly ordinary, was now imbued with significance by the persistent scrutiny that surrounded her. Outside, villagers moved quietly along snowbound lanes, observing and recording what they could. Footprints were traced, sounds noted, and small gestures of motion catalogued in silence. Children lingered at windows, catching subtle movements missed by the adults. The collective attentiveness of Ashcombe had become almost ritualized, each resident participating in the slow and deliberate gathering of patterns that might hint at hidden intentions. The Reeve, John Weaver, coordinated the day's examinations with meticulous care. Father Thomas offered soft guidance, emphasizing reflection, observation, and patience. No action was rushed, no judgment made lightly. Their words and presence lent authority to the process, providing structure and calm to a village caught in the delicate balance between curiosity and apprehension. Alice's routines were again the focus of formal scrutiny. She was asked to perform sequences with herbs and powders, to demonstrate the preparation of simple remedies, and to arrange objects in patterns specified by observers. Each movement was catalogued, subtle deviations noted, and minor inconsistencies weighed against prior observations. Her calm and precise demeanor became a central point of attention, both reassuring and unsettling to those who watched. The villagers' attention extended beyond Alice herself. The placement of objects within her home, the flow of smoke from the hearth, the subtle reflections of light upon the walls and floors, all were noted. Even the rhythm of her footsteps, the slight pause before adjusting a bundle, or the tilt of her head as she observed a flicker of flame became elements of interpretation, adding depth to the ongoing study of her behavior. Conversations in the evenings became more deliberate. Families gathered near hearths to recount the day's observations, to compare notes, and to discuss minor irregularities. Children contributed their observations, noting small details adults might overlook. The snow outside reflected the faint light of the hearths, softening edges and amplifying the quiet murmur of discussion. The village existed in a state of measured reflection, where every word, every gesture, and every remembered detail contributed to the slow unfolding of understanding. New measures were introduced by the Reeve and Father Thomas. Slight variations in routine were requested, subtle tests of memory and attentiveness imposed. Alice responded with steady composure, performing each task with deliberate precision, yet the observers catalogued every nuance. Small differences, barely perceptible, were discussed and analyzed. The process, slow and patient, began to turn ordinary actions into questions of significance, subtle hints of patterns, and potential intention. The wind pressed against Ashcombe with faint insistence, rattling eaves and hollowing out the silence of streets and lanes. Even the animals of the village were observed. The movement of livestock in pens, the quiet rustle of birds in skeletal trees, and the cautious progress of small mammals through snowdrifts. Every detail, every sound, every motion was part of the fabric of observation, contributing to the slow accumulation of knowledge that defined the village's attention. Alice herself seemed to embrace the persistent observation. Her gestures were careful, her words precise, her presence calm and deliberate. She moved through her routines with quiet authority, a subtle assertion of autonomy amidst the vigilant eyes of the villagers. Her work at the hearth, the preparation of remedies, and the tending of her herbs all carried a rhythm that was both ordinary and profoundly significant under the scrutiny of sustained observation. Evenings grew longer, shadows stretching across snow-laden lanes and cottages. The village, though quiet, remained alert. Residents discussed patterns, compared observations, and reflected upon what might be implied by small inconsistencies or unusual gestures. Sleep brought little relief, as dreams were colored by observation and speculation. Patterns replayed in memory, subtle movements reconsidered, and minor deviations magnified in the quiet stillness of night. By the 10th part, the procedures had become almost ritualistic. Alice's daily life, previously unremarkable, had been transformed into a slow, deliberate examination. Each repetition reinforced knowledge. Each slight variation demanded reflection. The villagers, guided by Father Thomas and the Reeve, had created a rhythm of scrutiny that infused every action, every glance, every gesture with quiet significance. The snow continued to blanket Ashcombe, muffling sounds and softening edges, yet it amplified the tension that had grown steadily over weeks. Alice's calmness remained a central element of this tension. Her presence in the cottage, her precise routines, and her composed responses to each test became a subtle challenge to the villagers' scrutiny. In her quiet steadfastness, she asserted a form of control over the observation itself, her gestures and movements forming a counterpoint to the slow, persistent accumulation of attention surrounding her. The villagers' collective awareness had reached a heightened state. Every action within the village was noted and compared, every gesture assessed and weighed. Even ordinary events were imbued with potential significance, each subtle deviation interpreted through the lens of ongoing scrutiny. The rhythm of Ashcombe had become one of observation, reflection, and patient anticipation, a slow but steady build toward the next phase of discernment. By the close of Part 10, Ashcombe existed in a state of quiet tension. The villagers, deeply immersed in observation and reflection, had created a persistent awareness that touched every corner of the village. Alice remained calm at the center of this attention, her routines unbroken, her gestures deliberate, and her presence steady. The accumulation of days and weeks of scrutiny had woven a delicate web of anticipation, reflection, and subtle suspense, leaving the village poised on the threshold of the next stage, where the slow turning of attention might edge closer to judgment. Ashcombe remained cloaked in a muted winter light, the snowbound lanes and frost-laden rooftops softening the outlines of the village while simultaneously sharpening the perception of small details. Every movement, every gesture, every whisper of sound carried weight under the careful scrutiny of those who walked the streets or lingered near windows. The wind, thin and insistent, pressed through hedgerows and around eaves, moving like a quiet witness to the village's ongoing attentiveness. Alice Redding continued her daily routines with a steady, deliberate composure. The grinding of roots into fine powders, the arrangement of herbs, the stirring of liquids over the low-burning hearth, all were performed with measured care. Yet within the calm of her movements lay an awareness of eyes upon her, subtle and omnipresent. Every motion was catalogued, every pause noted, every gesture interpreted in the context of weeks of observation. The Reeve, John Weaver, and Father Thomas orchestrated the day's examinations with meticulous attention. Variations in Alice's usual routines were requested, sequences of actions subtly altered, and her responses carefully noted. The process was slow, patient, and deliberate, designed to uncover patterns, reveal consistencies, or highlight discrepancies without overt confrontation. Outside, villagers continued their vigilant observation. Footsteps were traced in the snow, animal movements recorded, and the positions of doors, windows, and smoke from chimneys carefully noted. Children lingered near the edges of cottages, their wide eyes catching details unnoticed by adults. Even the faintest disturbance, a tilting branch, a fluttering curtain, a shift of light upon a wall, was considered potentially meaningful within the larger tapestry of observation. Alice's presence became increasingly central to the village's collective focus. Her calm composure, precise gestures, and deliberate speech formed a counterpoint to the persistent scrutiny surrounding her. Every movement she made was both ordinary and, under observation, imbued with significance. The villagers began to interpret subtle gestures as signs, ordinary actions as potential indications of intent, and minor deviations from routine as markers of meaning. Father Thomas continued to guide the observers, emphasizing careful reflection, impartiality, and the distinction between ordinary life and potentially extraordinary patterns. His measured voice offered structure to the day's activities, reminding the villagers to observe patiently, to refrain from hasty judgment, and to consider all details with thoughtful attention. Formal testing within Alice's cottage persisted. She was asked to perform sequences of tasks with herbs and powders, to demonstrate remedies under scrutiny, and to arrange objects according to prescribed patterns. Every motion was catalogued, every variation noted, and small inconsistencies carefully compared with previous observations. The cumulative weight of these repeated examinations began to create a subtle tension, almost imperceptible, that permeated the room and extended outward into the village. Evenings were filled with discussion and reflection. Families gathered near hearths to recount the day's observations, to compare notes, and to deliberate on minor irregularities. Children shared their observations, often noticing details overlooked by adults. The snow outside amplified the quiet murmur of conversation, reflecting dim light and muffling extraneous sounds, while reinforcing the village's collective attentiveness. The villagers' awareness extended beyond Alice herself. The rhythm of smoke from chimneys, the faint scuttle of animals in the underbrush, the shifting of snow across paths, all were integrated into the ongoing pattern of observation. Each minor anomaly, however small, was considered in context, contributing to the growing network of insight, conjecture, and subtle interpretation. Alice's calmness remained both a reassurance and a subtle provocation. Her gestures, deliberate and precise, carried a quiet authority amidst the persistent gaze of observers. Each movement through her cottage or along snowbound lanes became part of the dialogue of observation, a statement of measured autonomy within a web of scrutiny. Even the smallest acts, adjusting a bundle, tilting a head, pausing to breathe, were imbued with significance by those who watched. The wind whispered through Ashcombe, carrying faint sounds of movement and shadow across streets and lanes. Livestock shifted cautiously in pens, birds moved silently through skeletal trees, and small animals scuttled beneath snowdrifts. Every detail was noted, compared, and integrated into the villagers' reflection. Ordinary events became subject to interpretation, gestures and motions imbued with layered meaning, and the rhythm of the village had become one of sustained observation and careful consideration. By this 11th part, the ongoing scrutiny had created a subtle, almost imperceptible tension that threaded through Ashcombe. Days were measured not only by the passing of sunlight but by the careful observation of patterns, the noting of minor inconsistencies, and the patient reflection upon each detail. Alice's routines, once ordinary, had become a lens through which the villagers examined the ordinary and extraordinary alike. The process of observation had itself become a rhythm of the village. Every footstep in the snow, every flicker of shadow, every gesture within cottages contributed to a network of attention. Patterns were discerned slowly, with subtle distinctions considered, and even slight deviations interpreted as potentially meaningful. The villagers had entered a sustained cycle of attentiveness, reflection, and gentle anticipation, where the ordinary had become layered with subtle significance. Alice's presence at the center of this attention was both steadying and provocative. Her calm composure, deliberate gestures, and measured speech served to highlight the contrast between ordinary action and persistent observation. Every routine, every motion, every small choice became part of the ongoing dialogue of scrutiny, reinforcing both the villagers' attentiveness and the quiet assertion of her own agency. By the close of Part 11, Ashcombe existed in a state of quiet, intricate tension. The villagers, immersed in meticulous observation, had created a delicate web of awareness encompassing every corner of the village. Alice, at the center of this network, maintained her calm, deliberate composure, her routines uninterrupted, her gestures precise, and her presence quietly assertive. The accumulation of days and weeks of attention had transformed ordinary life into an ongoing examination of pattern, subtlety, and meaning, leaving the village poised on the threshold of the next phase, where interpretation might begin to merge with intention, and observation might edge closer to the first cautious steps of judgment. Ashcombe awoke beneath a sky that bore the soft gray weight of early winter, the snow covering lanes, rooftops, and hedgerows in a quiet, muffling embrace. The village moved with measured slowness, each step across the packed snow deliberate, every gesture watched and recorded in the silent attentiveness that had come to define the community. Even the wind, thin and insistent, whispered through the skeletal trees and rattled shingles, adding a subtle, persistent murmur to the quiet day. Alice Redding's movements were precise, her attention to routine unwavering. She ground herbs into powder, arranged bundles of roots and flowers, and stirred liquids over the hearth with the calm diligence of long practice. Yet beneath this quiet labor lay a sharp awareness. Every motion, every pause, every tilt of her head was observed, catalogued, and interpreted. The villagers' watchfulness had intensified, and the ordinary was beginning to yield small hints of unease. John Weaver, the Reeve, coordinated the day's examinations with deliberate care, while Father Thomas offered gentle guidance, urging patience, impartiality, and careful reflection. No action was rushed, no judgment was forced, yet the rhythm of observation itself had begun to alter the village's perception. Minor inconsistencies, subtle gestures, and even the repetition of routine were increasingly noted with deeper significance, suggesting hidden patterns or potential meaning. Alice's tasks that day were similar to those she performed each morning, yet every action was shadowed by interpretation. She arranged herbs in sequences specified by observers, measured liquids with steady hands, and adjusted bundles with precision. The villagers catalogued each gesture, the precise angle of her fingers, the tilt of her head as she watched a flame, the sequence in which she handled each object. Even small deviations, hardly perceptible, were weighed against the cumulative record of her routines, and each offered a spark for conjecture. Children watched from the edges of cottages and snowbound lanes, their sharp eyes noting details adults might miss. The flutter of a bird, the subtle ripple of water beneath ice, a faint sound behind a shutter, all were added to the village's accumulating record. Their observations, often simple and direct, reinforced the adults' reflections, lending clarity to small phenomena that otherwise might have been overlooked. The villagers' attention extended to every detail of the cottage. Smoke drifting from the hearth, shadows cast upon walls, the quiet movement of objects on shelves. Each was considered meaningful, every minor anomaly catalogued. Ordinary acts of preparation, movement, and tending the fire now carried layers of interpretation, as if the very air itself insisted that nothing be taken as neutral. Evenings brought discussions by the hearth, where families reflected upon the day's observations. Notes were compared, patterns debated, and subtle inconsistencies discussed with quiet insistence. The snow outside amplified the faint glow of firelight and muffled extraneous sounds, reinforcing a mood of attentiveness. Conversations, gentle yet persistent, wove a network of scrutiny that slowly drew attention toward questions of intention and motive, even if these remained unspoken. The villagers' perception began to shift imperceptibly. Actions that had once seemed ordinary were now interpreted as deliberate, sequences of routine examined for hidden meaning. Alice's calm composure, her precise gestures, and her measured speech, all previously seen as markers of skill, began to take on the hue of subtle defiance, an assertion of autonomy within the tight lattice of observation. Father Thomas continued to urge careful reflection, reminding the villagers to distinguish between ordinary craft and extraordinary pattern, between coincidence and intention. Yet the rhythm of sustained observation had already begun to shape perception. Each repetition, each minor deviation, carried the possibility of significance, and the cumulative effect of weeks of scrutiny rendered the ordinary mysterious and the familiar suspect. The Reeve introduced new variations in testing. Sequences of herbs were altered, liquids measured in unfamiliar increments, bundles arranged in novel patterns. Alice responded with steady precision, yet the observers catalogued every motion, noting even the subtlest change in tempo, hand position, or gaze. What had once been neutral now acquired a resonance of potential meaning, each action open to interpretation in the slow, reflective rhythm of the village. The wind pressed through Ashcombe, rustling branches and stirring snow across the lanes. Livestock moved cautiously in pens, birds fluttered among skeletal trees, and small animals scuttled beneath snowdrifts. Every movement became part of the fabric of observation, a reminder that even the quietest act could carry significance. The village existed in a delicate balance between routine and reflection, attention and interpretation, calm and the quiet onset of concern. Alice remained at the center of this delicate web. Her composure was unbroken, her gestures deliberate, her routines precise. Yet the awareness that every motion was interpreted, catalogued, and reflected upon introduced a subtle tension. Each pause, each tilt of her head, each adjustment of a bundle carried potential weight, and even her calm steadiness now seemed to suggest the possibility of intention beyond simple craft. The villagers' cumulative attentiveness intensified, drawing them into patterns of quiet speculation. Every detail of the day, footsteps across the snow, flickers of shadow, the tilt of smoke from a chimney, was catalogued and compared with prior days. Repetition became a form of communication, deviations a signal. The ordinary, under this persistent gaze, began to acquire the faint contours of intrigue. By the end of the 12th part, Ashcombe had entered a season of subtle yet unmistakable tension. Observation, reflection, and patient scrutiny had transformed ordinary life into a lattice of meaning, where gestures, sequences, and pauses were interpreted as signs. Alice, at the center of this attention, maintained her calm and precision, yet the villagers' perception had begun to tilt imperceptibly toward suspicion. The accumulation of days, weeks, and subtle observations had woven a quiet web of anticipation and reflection, leaving the village poised on the threshold of the first cautious steps toward potential accusation. The snow continued to blanket Ashcombe, softening contours, muffling sound, and reflecting pale light. The wind whispered through lanes and across rooftops, carrying the faint murmur of movement and the quiet rustle of branches. Within cottages, along frozen paths, and beside hearths, the villagers remained watchful, their attention focused, their perceptions subtly shifting. Ashcombe existed in a delicate balance between calm and apprehension, between observation and the first tendrils of suspicion, as the slow rhythm of reflection began to prepare the village for the next stage of discernment. The village of Ashcombe awoke beneath a sky heavy with the muted gray of winter, snow still laying a thick, quiet blanket over roofs, lanes, and hedgerows. Each step upon the frozen ground produced a faint, measured crunch, and even the slightest rustle of wind through skeletal branches seemed magnified, filling the spaces between cottages with a subtle tension. The village had grown accustomed to long days of observation, to the gentle but unyielding scrutiny of its inhabitants. Yet a quiet shift had begun to settle over Ashcombe, perceptible only to those who watched with the most attentive eyes. Alice Redding moved through her cottage with the same deliberate precision she had maintained for weeks. Herbs were ground into fine powders, liquids stirred over the hearth, and bundles of roots carefully arranged upon shelves and tables. Every gesture was measured, every motion deliberate, yet the persistent gaze of the villagers imbued even the smallest act with significance beyond its ordinary purpose. Each tilt of her head, each pause in her hands, each breath drawn in quiet reflection became an element of interpretation, and the observer's focus sharpened in subtle, cumulative ways. The Reeve, John Weaver, maintained a quiet authority over the day's procedures. Father Thomas, as always, encouraged calm reflection, careful attention, and patient discernment. Yet the rhythm of observation had begun to exert its own weight. Minor inconsistencies or deviations, once easily dismissed, were now catalogued with careful attention, their significance debated in hushed tones during evening gatherings. The ordinary had begun to bear the burden of expectation. Each repetition, each subtle shift, seemed to whisper possibilities previously unconsidered. Alice's routines continued to form the focal point of observation. She arranged herbs in prescribed sequences, measured liquids with steady hands, and adjusted bundles in patterns requested by the observers. Each gesture, though familiar, was recorded with meticulous attention. The angle of her fingers, the slope of her shoulders, the faintest change in posture or gaze. Even when performing simple tasks, the villagers interpreted her movements as layered with potential meaning, every slight deviation offering a glimmer of conjecture. Outside, the snow reflected the pale winter light, softening forms yet amplifying the minutest disturbance. Footsteps traced in the fresh frost were studied, small animals' tracks noted, and the faint patterns of smoke drifting from chimneys carefully observed. Children, alert and keen-eyed, pointed out details adults might have overlooked. A flicker of shadow across a wall, the subtle tremor of a branch, a pause in the movement of smoke above a hearth. Each observation was added to the growing tapestry of scrutiny that enveloped Ashcombe. Evenings were spent by hearths in deliberate discussion. Families shared observations, compared subtle deviations, and reflected on patterns that had emerged over days and weeks. Children contributed the clarity of their simple perceptions, noting gestures and movements, while adults interpreted those observations within the context of cumulative scrutiny. Every conversation, hushed yet persistent, wove the threads of interpretation ever tighter around the routines of Alice, whose calm composure now both reassured and unsettled the village. The villagers' perception of ordinary life had shifted subtly. Gestures once considered trivial now appeared deliberate. Sequences of routine were scrutinized for hidden significance. Alice's measured actions, her precise speech, and her deliberate movements began to take on the hue of subtle defiance, asserting autonomy within the matrix of observation. Each repetition became a test, each deviation a potential signal. Father Thomas continued to offer counsel, reminding the villagers to weigh observation with reflection, to distinguish between ordinary skill and extraordinary pattern, and to consider the possibility of coincidence rather than intent. Yet the fabric of prolonged attention had begun to alter perception. The cumulative weight of continuous observation rendered the ordinary unusual, the familiar suggestive, and the routine laden with potential meaning. The reeve introduced small variations into the day's exercises. Bundles of herbs were requested in new sequences, liquids measured in unfamiliar increments, and tasks repeated with slight adjustments. Alice, with unwavering composure, performed each action with deliberate precision. Observers catalogued every motion, every pause, every tilt of the hand or head, interpreting even the smallest nuance as a possible signal. The ordinary actions of preparation and care became interwoven with layers of quiet tension. As the village's attention deepened and shifted, the wind whispered insistently through Ashcombe, pressing against the edges of doors and windows, rustling the skeletal branches of trees, and scattering light snow across the lanes. Livestock stirred in pens, birds flitted among the bare boughs, and small animals moved cautiously beneath drifts of snow. Each motion, however minor, was considered within the broader lattice of attention, a detail that might inform interpretation, pattern, or suspicion. The village existed in a delicate equilibrium between daily life and reflective scrutiny, every sound and movement measured against prior observation. Alice's composure remained steadfast, yet the weight of attention began to shape the subtleties of interaction. Each gesture of hers, however deliberate, was now accompanied by the quiet anticipation of observation. A pause in her work, the angle of a glance, the subtle motion of her hands. Each became a possible hint, a potential clue to intention, magnified by the attentive focus of those who surrounded her. The familiar was transformed into something suggestive, the ordinary into a whisper of intrigue. By midwinter, Ashcombe had entered a state of intricate, quiet tension. Observation had become both routine and ritual, a rhythm that measured each day, each action, and each gesture. The villagers were attuned to the smallest detail, interpreting every movement, every deviation, and every repetition with patient scrutiny. Even the patterns of smoke from chimneys and the soft rustle of snow across hedgerows contributed to the collective awareness, as though the village itself had become a living participant in the unfolding assessment. The focus upon Alice intensified. Her calmness, previously seen as reassurance, now carried a subtle weight of challenge. Every motion, each preparation, each tilt of the head, and every pause in routine became a statement of self-possession and quiet authority. The villagers, while still cautious, found themselves interpreting ordinary acts as laden with suggestion, questioning whether precision might conceal intention, and whether routine could hide meaning. Evenings remained filled with careful discourse. Families discussed subtle discrepancies, repeated gestures, and minor variations in the day's observations. Children contributed small insights, noting patterns adults might overlook, and all reflections were woven into the ongoing lattice of interpretation. Each day's repetition, each familiar movement, now served as a point of reference for judgment, laying the groundwork for the first subtle suspicions that had yet to be voiced openly. By the close of Part 13, Ashcombe was poised on the brink of a subtle yet unmistakable shift. Observation, reflection, and patient scrutiny had transformed ordinary life into a complex lattice of potential meaning. Alice, at the center of this attention, continued her precise and deliberate routines, calm and composed, yet the villagers' perception had begun to tilt subtly toward suspicion. The accumulation of weeks of detailed observation had woven a quiet web of intrigue, anticipation, and reflection, leaving the village on the threshold where subtle doubt could grow into the first cautious expressions of concern. The snow continued to blanket Ashcombe, softening the contours of buildings and lanes, reflecting pale light and muffling sound. The wind whispered through the village, carrying hints of movement and shadow. Within cottages and along frozen paths, the inhabitants remained vigilant, their attention focused, their interpretations slowly evolving. Ashcombe existed in a delicate balance between calm, observation, and the first quiet tendrils of suspicion, as the slow rhythm of reflection continued to prepare the village for the next phase of discernment. Ashcombe awoke beneath a pale, frost-laden sky, the lingering snow softening the outlines of cottages and lanes, yet leaving faint impressions of the footfalls that had passed through the night. The village moved with deliberate care, each motion measured, each sound noted in the collective attentiveness that had become habitual. Even the wind, thin and insistent, carried the faint rustle of skeletal branches and the quiet stir of snow along hedgerows, seeming to whisper both observation and reflection. Alice Redding moved through her day with the quiet precision that had long defined her presence. Herbs were ground into powders, roots arranged with deliberate care, and liquids stirred over the low-burning hearth in sequences practiced for months. Every gesture was exact, every pause purposeful. Yet beneath this calm exterior lay the awareness that every movement, however minor, was recorded, catalogued, and considered by the attentive eyes of the villagers. The reeve, John Weaver, continued to oversee the day's sequences of observation. Father Thomas offered guidance, encouraging careful reflection, attention to detail, and the restraint of hasty judgment. Yet the rhythm of prolonged observation had begun to shape perception. Actions previously regarded as ordinary were now interpreted with greater significance. Minor variations or subtle deviations, once easily dismissed, now invited speculation, adding a growing tension beneath the otherwise serene rhythm of Ashcombe. Alice's routines were subjected to subtle variations. She was asked to prepare remedies in novel sequences, to measure liquids in unfamiliar increments, and to arrange bundles of herbs according to changing specifications. She complied with measured composure, yet each movement, tilt of the head, or shift of posture was catalogued with heightened scrutiny. Ordinary gestures became points of reflection, minor deviations assumed significance, and the villagers' perception began to intertwine observation with cautious conjecture. Outside, the snow reflected the pale winter light, softening forms while emphasizing even the smallest disruption. Footprints, the stirring of animals beneath the snow, the tilt of smoke from chimneys, and the quiet ripple of wind through trees. All were noted, discussed, and interpreted. Children contributed their sharp observations, noticing nuances overlooked by adults, while adults wove these details into the ongoing pattern of scrutiny, creating a complex lattice of attention around the rhythms of Alice's life. Evenings brought the familiar ritual of reflection by hearths. Families gathered to recount the day's observations, to compare subtle discrepancies, and to discuss the nuances of Alice's gestures. The discussions, measured and careful, reinforced the villagers' awareness of patterns, deviations, and repetitions. Though still cautious, the collective perception began to lean toward the possibility that ordinary actions might conceal intent, and that precision might mask subtle purpose beyond mere craft. The villagers' perception had shifted imperceptibly. Gestures once regarded as simple now suggested deliberation. Sequences of routine were interpreted as potential signals. Alice's calmness, her deliberate gestures, and her measured conduct now carried a subtle ambiguity, as though the very precision of her actions might conceal intention. Repetition itself became a form of communication, deviations from it a possible indication of motive. Father Thomas continued to counsel reflection and careful discernment, reminding villagers to weigh observation against coincidence, to consider the ordinary within the extraordinary, and to distinguish between skill and intent. Yet the prolonged scrutiny had begun to influence perception in ways beyond his control. Even the most measured observer found themselves interpreting small variations, pauses, and gestures as potentially meaningful, as though the steady rhythm of attention had imbued the everyday with a faint tension. The Reeve introduced additional variations to the day's tasks. Alice was asked to repeat sequences with subtle adjustments, to perform arrangements in unfamiliar patterns, and to respond to changes with measured precision. She complied calmly, yet every subtle shift in her gesture, posture, or focus was catalogued. Minor inconsistencies were discussed quietly in the evenings, their significance debated with gentle insistence. The village had entered a delicate stage where interpretation hovered at the edge of suspicion, the ordinary threaded with faint uncertainty. Outside, the wind pressed through Ashcombe, stirring snow across rooftops and lanes, rattling shutters and rustling skeletal branches. Livestock shifted cautiously in pens, birds fluttered between leafless trees, and small animals moved beneath drifts of snow. Each movement, each sound, each subtle shift of the environment contributed to the growing awareness of patterns, the careful mapping of behavior, and the slow emergence of subtle concern. Alice's composure remained steadfast, yet the sustained attention created a subtle, almost imperceptible tension. Each gesture, tilt of the head, or deliberate pause became a focal point for interpretation. The villagers observed these actions, catalogued them, and reflected upon their meaning. Every repetition, every minor alteration, carried the potential for significance, as though the calm steadiness of her behavior might conceal intention beneath its surface. By midwinter, Ashcombe existed in a quiet but intricate state of anticipation. Observation had become both ritual and habit, each day measured by the careful noting of actions and gestures. Repetition of routine was weighed against slight variations, the ordinary examined for hidden meaning. The villagers' attentiveness extended beyond Alice herself. Every faint sound, every shadow, every ripple of smoke or movement in the snow was woven into the fabric of interpretation, shaping perceptions of what was familiar and what might be concealed. Alice, central to this lattice of attention, continued her work with measured precision. Her calm composure, deliberate gestures, and precise routines asserted a quiet authority. Yet the villagers' perception was shifting. Subtle doubts began to mingle with observation. They began to ask themselves whether precision might conceal intent, whether calm composure might mask purpose, and whether repetition could signal something beyond ordinary craft. Evenings became increasingly reflective. Families discussed gestures, sequences, and minor deviations. Children added their observations, noting subtle details overlooked by adults. Conversations considered the patterns of behavior, the repetitions, and the occasional irregularity. Each reflection contributed to a slow, cautious shaping of suspicion, a gradual awareness that actions, though outwardly ordinary, might carry hidden significance. By the close of Part 14, Ashcombe had reached a subtle threshold. Observation, reflection, and scrutiny had transformed ordinary life into a network of potential meaning. Alice, at the center of the village's attention, maintained her calm, precise routines, yet the perception of the villagers had begun to tilt. The accumulation of weeks of careful scrutiny had woven a delicate web in which suspicion could quietly take root. Snow continued to blanket the village, muffling sound and softening outlines, while wind whispered through lanes and across rooftops, carrying the faint murmur of anticipation and reflection. Ashcombe existed in a balance of calm and latent concern, poised for the next stage, where quiet doubt might begin its gentle progression toward conscious suspicion. Ashcombe awoke under the softened light of a winter morning, the snow still covering lanes, rooftops, and hedgerows with a quiet, reflective blanket. The village moved slowly, each step across the frost-laden ground deliberate and measured, every gesture noted in the collective attentiveness that had grown over weeks of observation. Even the wind, thin and insistent, whispered through branches and along rooflines, carrying subtle shifts of sound that seemed to both announce and record each movement. Alice Redding continued her daily routines with her characteristic calm precision. Herbs were ground into fine powders, roots and flowers arranged meticulously, and liquids stirred over the hearth in sequences practiced for months. Every gesture remained measured, every pause purposeful. Yet beneath this unbroken composure lay the awareness of watchful eyes. The scrutiny of the villagers had begun to shift. Ordinary acts, once perceived as skillful and composed, were now interpreted as possible signs of intent, each subtle movement noted and reflected upon. The reeve, John Weaver, coordinated the day's observation with steady care. Father Thomas offered guidance in measured tones, urging careful reflection, attention to detail, and the avoidance of hasty judgment. Yet the persistent rhythm of observation had begun to influence perception. Small deviations, subtle gestures, and repeated sequences were now weighed with a new attentiveness, their significance debated with quiet insistence. The ordinary, under such sustained scrutiny, was becoming layered with subtle tension. Alice's routines were tested with slight variations. She was asked to perform sequences in different orders, to measure liquids in unfamiliar increments, and to adjust arrangements of herbs and roots according to new specifications. She complied with calm precision, yet every gesture, every tilt of the head, every subtle change in posture was recorded and considered. Even minor inconsistencies, once easily dismissed, were now catalogued and discussed, adding faint threads of concern to the fabric of observation that enveloped the village. Outside, the pale winter light reflected from the snow, softening forms while accentuating the minutest disturbance. Footprints across lanes, the subtle movements of animals beneath the snow, the shifting of smoke from chimneys, all were noted and interpreted. Children, alert and observant, noticed details overlooked by adults. A flicker of shadow, the faint rustle of leaves under snow, a subtle shift in smoke's direction. These observations were woven into the collective understanding, creating a dense lattice of scrutiny around Alice's daily life. Evenings were spent in measured reflection. Families gathered by hearths to recount the day's observations, compare notes, and discuss patterns. Children contributed their simple, yet perceptive, insights, noting the tiniest gestures and pauses, while adults debated interpretations and considered possible significance. Slowly, the rhythm of discussion began to shift. Subtle apprehension began to mingle with attentive observation, raising questions that had been previously unspoken. The villagers' perception of Alice's actions began to alter. What had once seemed merely precise now suggested deliberation beyond ordinary skill. Repetition, once a sign of meticulousness, was now interpreted as deliberate signaling. Gestures previously seen as ordinary began to carry potential meaning, hints of hidden intent. The calmness of Alice's behavior, once reassuring, now possessed an ambiguous weight, a quiet authority that both stabilized and unsettled those who observed. Father Thomas continued to counsel care and measured discernment, emphasizing the distinction between coincidence and intent, skill and motive. Yet even with this guidance, the extended period of scrutiny had begun to shift perception. Ordinary acts acquired a latent significance, gestures became suggestive, and minor deviations prompted reflection on purpose and possible consequence. The village's awareness had grown sensitive to the faintest irregularities, and subtle concern began to take root. The reeve introduced further variations in daily routines. Alice was asked to repeat sequences with slight modifications, perform arrangements in unfamiliar patterns, and respond to changes in tasks with calm precision. She complied without hesitation, yet every minute movement, every pause, and every shift of expression was carefully noted. Minor anomalies, subtle inconsistencies, and slight departures from previous patterns were debated quietly among observers, producing an undercurrent of cautious apprehension that threaded through the village. The wind moved insistently through Ashcombe, stirring snow across rooftops and lanes, rattling shutters, and whispering through bare branches. Livestock shifted uneasily in pens, birds flitted between leafless trees, and small animals moved with caution beneath drifts of snow. Every motion, every sound, and every disturbance contributed to the village's cumulative awareness, reinforcing the sense that ordinary life had become interwoven with subtle signals, and that even the smallest acts could carry unforeseen weight. Alice remained the center of attention, her calmness unwavering, yet each gesture, tilt of the head, and careful movement became a focal point for interpretation. Repetition, precision, and deliberate composure were increasingly seen not merely as skill but as markers of intention. Even the most ordinary sequences were imbued with significance, and the villagers' reflections slowly wove a pattern in which apprehension and observation began to merge. By midwinter, Ashcombe had entered a delicate state of quiet tension. Observation had become habitual and ritualized, each day measured by the noting of movements, gestures, and minor variations. Repetition was scrutinized for hidden meaning, and even the subtlest anomalies invited reflection. The villagers' attentiveness extended beyond Alice to the sounds of the wind, the movements of animals, and the patterns of smoke, each element integrated into the evolving perception of order, deviation, and potential significance. Alice's presence, at the center of this scrutiny, remained calm and precise. Her deliberate actions and measured gestures were a quiet assertion of control, yet the villagers' perception had begun to shift toward cautious suspicion. Questions, previously unspoken, started to form in the minds of observers. Could intention lie beneath precision? Could subtle gestures conceal purpose? Could repeated actions indicate more than diligence, perhaps intention that was not yet understood? Evenings became more reflective, and discussions by the hearth grew subtly charged. Families debated gestures, sequences, and minor deviations, interpreting them within the cumulative context of weeks of observation. Children contributed sharp insights, noticing patterns adults might overlook. Slowly, cautious suspicion began to develop, a quiet, persistent awareness that something might lie beneath Alice's ordinary appearance and actions. By the close of Part 15, Ashcombe existed in a fragile balance between calm, observation, and the first clear signs of suspicion. Observation, reflection, and careful scrutiny had transformed daily life into a complex lattice of potential meaning. Alice, at the center of attention, maintained her composure and precision, yet the perception of the villagers had begun to lean toward the possibility of hidden intent. Snow continued to soften the village's contours, muffling sound and reflecting pale light, while wind whispered through lanes and across rooftops, carrying the quiet murmur of expectation and cautious apprehension. Ashcombe teetered on the edge of a new phase, where observation might gradually shift toward deliberation and judgment. Ashcombe awoke under a sky brushed with the faintest hint of dawn. The snow still draped over rooftops, lanes, and hedgerows, softening their contours and muting all sharp edges of the landscape. The village moved with quiet deliberation, each footstep measured, every motion watched not with accusation, but with an attentive, reflective care that had grown from weeks of observation. Even the wind, stirring through skeletal branches and along the frozen lanes, carried no urgency, only a gentle, persistent whisper, as if the world itself insisted upon reflection before action. Alice Redding began her day as she always had, with deliberate precision. Herbs were ground into powders, roots and flowers arranged carefully upon tables and shelves, and liquids stirred over the hearth in long-practiced sequences. Each gesture was deliberate, each movement slow and measured, yet beneath her calm composure lay the awareness that the village's eyes were upon her. Weeks of observation had intensified the attentiveness of Ashcombe, creating a rhythm in which every repetition, every pause, and every tilt of the head could hold meaning. The reeve, John Weaver, continued his quiet oversight of the village's reflections. Father Thomas, ever a voice of temperance, encouraged patience, measured observation, and thoughtful reflection, urging that judgment follow careful discernment rather than impulse. Yet even with this guidance, the prolonged scrutiny of Alice's actions had left its mark. Small gestures, the rhythm of routine, and minor deviations were interpreted with heightened sensitivity. The ordinary had become extraordinary in the collective consciousness of Ashcombe. Throughout the day, Alice performed her routines with her customary diligence. Herbs were measured, roots tied, and liquids stirred, each movement precise and unhurried. The villagers observed quietly, cataloging gestures, pauses, and subtle shifts. Yet a new quality had emerged in their attention, a sense of reflection rather than suspicion. While the awareness of potential deviation persisted, it had softened into a contemplative focus, a slow, careful study of patterns rather than an immediate anticipation of wrongdoing. Outside, the winter landscape lent its quiet authority to the day. Snow reflected pale light into windows, muffled the steps of villagers, and softened the movements of animals beneath the drifts. Livestock stirred slowly in pens, birds moved between the leafless branches of trees, and small animals crept along the edges of snowbound lanes. Each movement contributed to the village's understanding of rhythm and pattern, integrating naturally into the delicate lattice of attention that had come to define Ashcombe's days. By mid-morning, discussions by hearths and around small fires had taken on a reflective tone. Families recounted observations of the past weeks, comparing sequences, gestures, and minor variations in Alice's routines. Children, perceptive as ever, noticed patterns overlooked by adults, offering insights that were incorporated into broader reflection rather than judgment. Conversations moved from conjecture toward understanding, and a shared sense of measured contemplation began to replace the subtle tension that had previously characterized the village's attention. Alice's calm presence remained central to this process. Her deliberate actions, the precision of her gestures, and the measured pace of her routines asserted a quiet authority. Yet the villagers' perception had shifted. Where once her composure had been interpreted as ambiguity, it now suggested steadiness. Where minor deviations had implied intent, they were now recognized as human subtlety. The rhythm of her life, once a source of tension, now offered a gentle lesson in patience and attentiveness. Father Thomas encouraged this reflective approach, emphasizing that understanding arises not from immediate suspicion but from sustained attention, careful observation, and the slow, patient discernment of patterns. The villagers, influenced by this guidance, began to see Alice's routines as part of a natural order, a sequence of skillful practice rather than a deliberate concealment. Questions about intention remained, but their weight was tempered by weeks of accumulated perspective, the small inconsistencies reconciled within a broader view of human behavior. By afternoon, Ashcombe had assumed a gentle rhythm. Observation continued, but it was no longer underscored by anxiety or suspicion. Every movement, every gesture, every repetition was catalogued not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as a thread in the intricate fabric of life within the village. The snow outside, the faint rustle of wind through skeletal branches, the soft stir of animals beneath drifts, all contributed to a serene attentiveness, a quiet awareness of the interconnectedness of daily life. Alice's day proceeded without disruption. Herbs were bundled, powders measured, and liquids stirred in the hearth's gentle warmth. Each gesture was precise, deliberate, and unhurried. The villagers noted, reflected, and learned, yet the previous tension had softened into a contemplative, almost meditative observation. The lattice of attention that had woven around Alice was no longer a net of suspicion but a framework for understanding, a quiet study of rhythm, skill, and measured care. Evening descended slowly over Ashcombe, the pale winter light fading into gentle twilight. Snow softened the outlines of cottages, lanes, and hedgerows, and the wind's whispering had taken on a more neutral cadence. Families gathered by hearths, recounting the day's events with measured calm. Children added their observations, yet the discussions were now filled with reflection and appreciation rather than conjecture and apprehension. The village had settled into a steady rhythm of awareness, attentive yet unburdened by anxiety. By nightfall, the calm that had gradually emerged throughout the day enveloped Ashcombe. The snow, the quiet wind, the faint stirrings of animals, and the steady routines of Alice all contributed to an atmosphere of serene attentiveness. Observation had become a practice of reflection rather than anticipation, understanding rather than suspicion. The rhythm of daily life, previously shaded by subtle tension, now carried the soft glow of measured awareness. Alice's calm presence at the center of the village's attention remained unchanged. Her gestures, precise and deliberate, her routines, unhurried and exacting, and her composure, steady and confident, had transformed from sources of intrigue and suspicion into markers of continuity and skill. The villagers' perception, once shifting toward doubt, had settled into a tempered understanding, a recognition that even precision and repetition may be expressions of care and experience, not concealment. In the quiet of the final night, Ashcombe seemed to breathe gently beneath the weight of winter's snow. The villagers rested with a sense of reflective calm, having learned the rhythms of their community, the subtle patterns of behavior, and the quiet persistence of attentiveness. Observation, which had once suggested suspicion, had become a practice of understanding. Gestures that had seemed ambiguous were now appreciated for their deliberation and care. As the hearths glowed softly within cottages, the snow continued to blanket the village, muffling footsteps and smoothing the contours of the landscape. The wind's whispering had softened into a steady murmur, blending with the quiet stir of animals beneath drifts, the faint movement of smoke, and the gentle rhythm of daily life. Ashcombe existed in a delicate balance, calm and reflective, attentive yet unburdened by suspicion, its people having moved through the slow passage of weeks into a serene understanding of the ordinary and the subtle. And so, the story of Alice Redding and the attentive village of Ashcombe drew to a gentle close. Observation had flowed into reflection, suspicion into understanding, and tension into measured calm. The snow, the wind, the gestures, and the rhythms of life had all contributed to a quiet lesson, that attentiveness, patience, and careful reflection illuminate the ordinary, transforming uncertainty into comprehension and allowing life to continue with a quiet, enduring grace.